Good afternoon, and welcome to the second day of the fifth annual conference of the Race Inequality and Language in Education program at Stanford University. This year's theme focuses on pursuing educational equity in uncertain times. One of the trademarks of the RILE program here at Stanford is that it is an interdisciplinary program that brings together scholars and researchers from many different disciplines: educational linguistics, economics, anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, you name it. The list goes on. This ensures that the research is relevant to everyone who is interested in how race, poverty, inequality, language, and other relevant factors affect educational opportunity, equity, and excellence. We began the week yesterday with Dr. Linda Darling Hammond, Dr. Maria Ledesma, and Dr. Francis Pierman, sharing their profound thoughts with us and motivating us to contemplate important issues like how educational policy will need to change to serve students in the post-COVID era. And yesterday we were hosted by David Song. Thank you, David. Today's webinar is bringing together an amazing group of scholars who will be focusing on educational abolition. That is a revolutionary way of looking at the challenges that lie ahead. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our RILE graduate student host for today's seminar. Brian Cabral is a Chicagoan from White Village. He's a third-year PhD student in the RILE program here at Stanford and a master's candidate in sociology. His research broadly examines the intersections of race, carcinality, and abolition within the context of schooling, neighborhood politics, and education. Thank you, Brian.
So thank you, Dr. Ball. It's a privilege to be here briefly. And so as you mentioned, the topic of the conversation for today's panel is educational abolition. And because this topic is on abolition, this conversation necessitates that we take a brief moment to pause and to recognize that much of this work done by and through the RILE conference does take place in the traditional homelands of the Muwekma-Ohlone peoples. And I acknowledge that there are limits to this recognition, but that I deem it necessary as we discuss abolitionist thinking, which is tied to struggles for decolonization. And we hope that the knowledge that is produced, discussed, and built on in this conversation will better serve marginalized communities writ large, but especially Indigenous peoples. Now, we got some heavy hitters in our lineup today. And so I begin with introducing Dr. Kari Kokka, who is an assistant professor of mathematics education in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Leading at the University of Pittsburgh. She studies student and teacher perspectives of social justice mathematics and STEM teacher activism, and has been an educator for over 20 years and an educator organizer engaged in social justice mathematics work for 15 years. Next, we have Dr. Maxine McKinney de Royston, who's an assistant professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work centers around two research strands. Understanding the multidimensional and politicized nature of teaching and learning is the first one. The second is the examination of how learning environments, such as STEM classrooms, operate as racializing learning spaces. Up next, we have Dr. Subini Annamma, who's an associate professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Her research critically examines the way students are criminalized and resist that criminalization through the mutually constitutive nature of racism and ableism, how they interlock with other marginalizing oppressions, and how these intersections impact youth education trajectories in urban school and youth prisons. Fourth on our list, we have Dr. David Stovall, a professor in African American Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research broadly looks at critical race theory, the relationship between housing and education, and the intersection of race, place, and school. Fun fact, Stovall is my former high school teacher. So a huge shout out to him, to Chicago, and to Social Justice High School. And so last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Jonathan Rosa, a social, cultural, and linguistic anthropologist of education and associate professor at Stanford. His research theorizes the co-naturalization of language and race as key features of modern governance. Specifically, he analyzes the interplay between youth socialization, racial linguistic formation, and structural inequity in urban contexts. And so again, thank you all for being here. The format of this session will be a moderated conversation by one of our panelists, and you can feel free to follow us and extend the conversation through the means of social media, particularly Twitter, and use our hashtag on this side, hashtag RILE2020. And so without further ado, Dr. Annamma, the virtual floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Brian for that beautiful introduction. It was really, really important, and especially the land acknowledgement, including that is so important in this work. I want to thank Dr. Ball, Arnitha Ball, for putting together an incredible RILE program in which we all are learning from and engaging, and this being the 5th conference and continuing to grow every year. And then thank you to all of the panelists who are here, and of course, all of the folks who are supporting Dr. Ball in creating the RILE conference. So today we're going to talk about education and abolition. And I want to invite you all into this conversation, no matter where you stand and how you understand abolition. I myself don't consider myself some kind of deeply experienced abolitionist who knows everything. And in fact, I'm still learning about it quite a bit. I'm still understanding it. It's not a destination I think we get to. Abolition is something that we're always kind of moving towards and understanding and sharpening our conceptualizations of. So I just want to start the program by inviting us all in to really engage this work from wherever we're at in this moment. If we can put up the first slide. So when looking for a definition of abolition, we looked hard to try to figure out what a great definition is. And one of the definitions that I found that I felt was really powerful was from Critical Resistance. And it says, abolition isn't just about getting rid of buildings full of cages. It's also about undoing the society we live in, because the prison industrial complex both feeds on and maintains oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and controls millions of people. Because the prison industrial complex is not an isolated system, abolition is a broad strategy. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us towards making our dreams real and that lead us to all believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. So I think this is a really important and generative definition, and it really makes me think, as I said, I'm still learning about abolition. I do work in youth prisons, and that's how I came to abolition, and reading the work of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, and some other folks. So I would love to hear from you all how you define abolition, who do you draw from to build on your understanding abolition broadly, and who in education more specifically can you draw from?
Well, again, thanks again, Subini, for everything, and Dr. Ball for getting us all here. And Brother Brian, it's always good to see you, especially under these conditions. I think in terms of a definition of abolition, and I truly appreciate the critical resistance definition. I think for myself, it comes off in this space of a demand to end a practice that persistently dehumanizes and marginalizes, right? So if we think about what is happening in school space, what is happening in other social, political, and economic spaces, whether it be housing, education, employment, healthcare, and the like, the criminal legal system, it is the practices of dehumanization and these practices of marginalization that perpetually entrap certain people, largely Black, brown, indigenous, and other people of color. So when I think about abolition, I think about the practices we engage to end these strategies of dehumanization. And when in pulling from different folks, in addition to the folks that you mentioned in terms of Dr. Wilson Gilmore, I pull from folks like Dylan Rodriguez, Joy James, Sadia Hartman, Fred Moulton, Stefano Harney. And then in education specifically, I actually go to some older work. So Walimu Shuja wrote a piece, he edited a piece in the early 90s called Too Much Schooling and Too Little Education. And in the idea, the notion of schooling is this process of rote learning, not even rote learning, but just rote instruction, the idea of order and compliance. And then education is the process by which you ask questions of those things that dehumanize you. And then they even state this in the edited volume, when you make a decision to end those practices, right? And that, to me, is the abolishing of a practice. So for me, it's really around thinking about these practices that dehumanize, but now what are the strategies that we use to end them? And I think it's critically important, and thank you all again for this question, it's critically important that we state, we are not talking about reform. Reform is not enough. You cannot put a bow on a putrid turd and not think that it is still a piece of shit, right? So we got to be clear about that in terms of when we talk about this, because a lot of times I'm concerned when things get reduced to, well, if we make this thing that dehumanizes you a little bit better, then we're okay. And that's not it, right? It's a deeper question of our practice. And when we ask that deeper question of our practice, now we have to come to grips with how we participate in those practices that dehumanize. And now what are we willing to do to end those practices?
I guess I'll jump in on this too. Sorry, to play off of some of what Dave was saying. I think the notion that abolition could be conceptualized in relation to a refusal, a set of refusals, and a set of demands. A set of refusals around accepting liberal definitions of freedom, accepting that freedom has ever existed in a place like the United States or could ever exist in the US on its own terms, and hence the notion that the US, any reformist approach to defining what freedom could be in the US might work on some level. So refusing that as part of the beginning of this project, and then also demanding of a fundamentally different world, fundamentally different relations, broadly construed. And I guess for me, some of these questions around abolition, I came into them through my participation in a range of political organizing efforts in relation to the Puerto Rican independence movement and the incarceration of many Puerto Rican political prisoners over the years, many of whom were deeply invested in creating liberatory educational projects as well. And so for me, abolition and education are deeply intertwined. Anti-imperialism and abolition are deeply intertwined. Grappling with ecological devastation and abolition are deeply intertwined, and being careful not to just sort of invoke populations in homogenizing ways as though we were all targeted equally by cultures of punishment, but rather attending to the specificity of anti-Blackness, of transmisogyny, of xenophobia directed towards undocumented populations, and the ways that cultures of punishment target these specific groups. And then lastly, within education, I would just say some key thinkers. I think Dave pointed to some historical thinkers, but some contemporary thinkers who are guiding my thinking are people like Carla Shedd, Eve Ewing, and Savannah Shangay. I think Carla Shedd's notion of a carceral continuum really, I think a Foucauldian project couldn't understand race fully in a place like the United States, or colonialism fully in the United States, even if to some extent Foucault tried to do so. Carla has helped to point us to, I think, an understanding of punishment is not something that's part of a pipeline, a school to prison pipeline, but rather something that's built into all of our mainstream institutions and needs to be addressed in that broader, with that broader perspective. I think Savannah Shangay's work around, in her book, Progressive Dystopia, her look at the ways, or her attention to the ways that liberal fixes and reformist fixes are actually, reproduce the problem and reproduce the disposability of Black populations in particular, undocumented populations as well. So what looks like progress educationally, as Savannah lays it out in her analysis, is actually defined in deeply troublesome ways. And then lastly, Eve Ewing's recent work, her book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, I think attends to histories that are here, that are still present, and that never went away. And I think that this is so much of what we're grappling with right now, what it means to live in a place that is built on violence, that's rooted in foundational violence, where attention to voices and experiences that have been targeted by that violence is, we've been numbed to that kind of that history. And so I think Eve's work and the work of many other scholars alerts us to the ways that those histories are alive and unwell and demand to be reckoned with. And so an abolitionist project is part of that reckoning to me.
Go ahead, Dr. Kokka.
So I'll jump in. I'm joining you from Haudenosaunee lands, also called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm actually gonna offer a bit of a different perspective. I think that oftentimes people get stuck in the, okay, if we're gonna abolish this, what's the new thing gonna be? And in the meantime, while we are doing this work, what can we do? If I'm a classroom teacher, what can I do right now? And really, one of the people that I draw on the most is my principal from Vanguard High School, Luis Delgado, who recently passed. I knew I might cry. It's okay. I'm bringing my full self. I'm not gonna try to dehumanize myself right now. Vanguard High School was a school that Dr. Darling Hammond had suggested that I look into when I finished the STEP program 20 years ago. And Luis Delgado led with his heart. And so it's when I think about whose work am I drawing on, it's really like the work of his heart that I'm drawing on. We all had each other's cell phone numbers. The kids had our cell phone numbers. They had his cell phone number. And when there was a conflict that arose, he would buy, like if two kids had a conflict, he would buy them lunch. He would leave them in his room and say, y'all need to work it out, right? And so not only did he do this for the young people in the building, but he did that with us too, because we know adults have conflicts also, right? So he mediated between adults and students. And so I really draw on the work that he has done in terms of building those relationships and centering advisory and always believing in all of our potential as teachers and as students.
If I can just uplift something that I think that Dr. Kokka is saying that also pulls on what Dr. Rosa and Dr. Stovall say, is this notion of abolition is also a set of commitments, right? It's a set of refusals, it's a set of demands, but it's also a set of political and ethical commitments to a way of thinking, a way of being. And I think the example of Principal Delgado is a perfect example of that, right? Of demonstrating those commitments in everyday action in ways that have structural and systemic implications.
Thank you, all of you. This is a really important piece, because the set of commitments is so necessary, because I think when people hear the word abolish, they think of tear down. And this constant conversation about what we build and dream and imagine in its space has to be front and center when we're thinking of this. So when we hear about folks like Principal Delgado, and then all of these other incredible writers and thinkers, that's what we're all thinking about, right? And sometimes abolition just gets so narrowed down. And that's one of the things I really want us to think about is what does this look like in expansive and imagination? We're going to move on to our next topic, which is a piece that we're gonna watch a quick video. So Danielle, can you pull up that video? Danielle, you might be muted, and so we can't hear the video.
Noted. Thank you. Let's try again.
Thank you. And thanks to all the attendees who's letting us know. Okay, while Danielle is being so wonderful, this is one of our brilliant students who's figuring this out. We'll just keep talking and we'll see if we can get this video going, okay? So one of the
Actually,
things-
Subini, can I jump in on one of the comments that just came up a minute ago about abolition as, you know, not something that is just about tearing things down?
Yes, please.
I think that one of the things that, and this is why I appreciate some of the comments that my fellow panelists have made so far. You know, the idea that abolition is something that is a deferral for a future that is not yet here, rather than something that people out of necessity have had to create in order to exist, have had to create alternative economies, alternative kinship systems, alternative educational approaches, alternative modes of governance, alternative ideas about gender and sexuality. I think that these realities are here all around us, alternative modes of expression and communication, and we haven't cultivated an attentiveness to them. And that's why I was saying that Eve Ewing's work and the work of many other scholars has been so inspiring to me, because it seeks to attune us to these possibilities that are all around us, but yet are not, you know, that we haven't, I think, collectively supported and cultivated.
And and exactly to your point, Jonathan, so we can even frame abolition as a return to what was stolen from us, right? So this idea of being dispossessed of something. And if you have been dispossessed of something, now what are the practices and strategies that you use to take that thing back or to reclaim these things that we know to exist, right? This is all the way to kinship networks, to how we understand sexuality, to how we employ ourselves, to how we feed ourselves, right? So this thing around a return, right? Especially when we think about this notion of who gets caged and what is the rationale for their caging. So this is, and when we talk about schools, right? Who gets the under-resourced schools, right? And I think the point that Jeff Duncan Andrade and Ernest Morel made some years back, when we see a school in the traditional sense is thought to be in dysfunction, we need to understand that under white supremacy, that is a school doing exactly what it was intended to do, right? So if we see a school that doesn't have a library, we got 120 plus schools in Chicago that do not have libraries. We have to put that in context. And under white supremacy, that school is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, right? To further dehumanize those who have been made disposable, right? And abolition is saying we have made a commitment to see these people as valuable, right? As the catalyst to be able to change our condition, right? And I think that becomes important because a lot of times, just to Dr. Rosa's point, when people say abolition, the first thing they say, well, what do you mean, Stovall? Are you just gonna blow shit up and then people just gonna run out in the streets? Maybe, right? So this thing around, we now have to think about what this means in terms of really changing the narrative for ourselves, not for the larger world, but changing the narrative in terms of how we do our work.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think at this point, we're already in the space of where we wanted to go. So maybe we'll just skip that first video and we'll just keep on rolling. Because I've been thinking a lot about this, you know, I think you all know, like I do a lot of work in youth prisons. And one of the things for me is the conversation about abolition often doesn't reach youth prisons and doesn't reach education. Not always, of course, there are plenty of brilliant folks doing it. And Ruthie Wilson Gilmore talks about education as both experiencing what she calls organized abandonment, right? And that's what I think what Stovall is also talking about with schools under white supremacy already working in this way that criminalizes kids. And then we also have this idea of organized abandonment, which is the idea that we have chosen to, you know, when we're talking about defunding the police and everyone thinks it's such a radical idea, but we've defunded education for years, right? We've chosen to abandon them, as Professor Gilmore says. So if, can we think about, and we've already started, but how do you imagine education's relationship with and role in abolition? So both, how is it already experiencing criminalization? What is the role with abolition? Because the video that we were going to watch, which we can put the video, oh, and Danielle put it in the chat for those of you who want to see it, talks about when we defund the police, we'll put money in education. But if we know education is already criminalizing kids, as I write about, as Carla Shedd writes about, as Eve Ewan writes about, and many of you write about, then how do we rethink that, rethink education in particular ways in its relationship with abolition?
Yeah, I think one key thing with that is to understand that education is a microcosm of society, just like a school is a microcosm of society, right? So all of the carceral things that we see in schools represent the kind of carceral logics that define everyday life, right? And so I think one thing that we really need to push on when we think about education and abolition is that they're part of the same, they're responding to the same system, right? They're responding to the systems that Angela Davis writes about, that all the scholars that we've talked about write about, right? A system that is set upon a series of logics around dehumanization, around punitive, punishing logics, right? That's set around really just a system that's designed to tear people down, right? Especially those people that they don't consider people, right? And so I think when I think about how our education and abolition linked, I really think on a very local level of a classroom, right? I think about the kinds of carceral pedagogies that I see play out, right? I think about, why does a teacher feel invested in policing and surveilling the bodies of students when they're learning, or defining what learning looks like in that space, right? If we're talking about right now, we can think about, why is it so important that cameras are on to demonstrate whether or not kids are learning? Why is it so important that we have to have the audio on all the time so that teachers can hear whether or not kids are learning? So for me, it's really about, what do we think that, you know, education and learning look like on kids' bodies? And what do carceral logics look like when they're placed upon kids' bodies? And how do we isolate those logics? Because, you know, we've had Brown versus the Board of Education, we've had enslavement, human enslavement in this country supposedly ended in 1865, well, actually 1863, but not 1865 in other places, and much later actually in other places. But yet the logics of that enslavement have never been abolished. And we see that play out in schools, we see that play out in prisons, we see that play out in every sphere of life: public health, housing, right? Food systems, right? People are now talking about how there's supermarket redlining, right? That are all sort of based on these same kind of logics of not just sort of being punitive and dehumanizing, but fundamentally denying access to the right to live. And so for me, it can't be, they can't be decoupled because they're the same. And so I see somebody asking what carceral logics are. And so what that is a logic of punishment that define everything that we do. So the idea of logics is just the way that we make sense of the way that we understand things, right? So carceral logics is the way that we understand and the way we make sense around things is rooted in this notion of punishment and rooted in this notion of having to sort of break people's spirit, right? To be able for them to learn, to be reformed, to whatever. So it really depends upon the sphere of life and what that carceral logic looks like, but it's that underlying principle of how we make sense of what, what rights we have and what rights we don't.
Exactly.
Okay, jump in?
I wanted to jump in. I was going to just
Okay.
say, I just unmuted myself to snap, first of all, because that needed some snaps. But also like, and carceral logics, right? Like, I think what the way some of us write about it is, it includes the labeling, surveillance, and punishment. And it's a continual understanding of that is how we engage education, as alternatively, instead of the ways that I think a lot of us hope we engage education. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and I see this. This is and I'm looking at the chat because there's an important point that's connected to Chicago, right? So last week, I don't know if folks saw this nationally. There was a young person who was being sexually assaulted during class, right? So this was a 7-year-old girl who was being sexually assaulted during class. Law enforcement was called, and the person who did it was an 18-year-old. He was arrested, detained, and charged. And I think this particular understanding, when we think about abolition, and I think this is important when we look at school's relationship or education, and I'll say schooling because education I'm going to make to be something different, right? But if we look at schooling's relationship to abolition, we don't have a good measure around how we actually engage young folks in learning beyond assessments that don't tell us anything, right? And when we see that, now when we think about the safety of young people, now are we willing to confront other issues that make folks feel unsafe? Now, the assault that I just mentioned is part of a larger process, right? So now, before we pathologize all Black people, are we willing to look and say there were some issues that have probably gone unaddressed, largely under these carceral realities if we think about the COVID moment, right? So now, do we dare to think about another issue being addressed? Or, and this is a thing around transformative justice that people are not yet willing to embrace, right? This idea that we have to be willing to engage the pre-existing conditions that get us to that moment, as tragic and awful and horrible as it is. And our first response, and I think about it myself, my first response is to have some visceral physical reaction to if I came into contact with this person. But at the same time, if we think about abolition, now we have to think about the practices. How do we now see that if something is happening, it is connected to something else? And what are we willing to do to find out what that thing is connected to? And again, I want to be perfectly honest. It is a tough thing to do, and something that in many ways I am not prepared in many ways to engage. But I think we have to be serious about how we are willing to embrace this, because schools on the other side of this, on the other side of that sexual assault, we got folks trying to discipline young people on Zoom. How the hell does that work, right? So now a young person has the power to just cut you off, and we still want to police their bodies. So the question that I asked when I heard about the assault, was it about the protection of that young person or the policing of bodies on the belief of a Black pathology around sexual assault, right? And that, again, those are difficult questions to ask and stuff that we have to grapple with. But at the same time, again, difficult, but if we're serious about this, we can't run from those questions. So thanks to the person in the chat who mentioned that, because this is a real point that we have to begin to grapple with if we are serious about abolition and what it means.
And if I can just jump in real quick, I really appreciate that point of distinguishing education from schooling. And I think an unfortunate reality in the society is that we often operate as if they're exactly the same thing, which means that our imagination, right, the kind of abolitionist imaginary we might work through is limited, because we can only think about education and learning happening within schools versus happening in the spaces that we've created always and forever to continue our education, to support our learning, that operate outside of the carceral gaze within schools. And so that distinction between education and schooling, it's not semantic. It can't be understated, right? It's fundamentally a shift to recognize that our humanity and our ability to learn and grow happen primarily outside of schools.
Yes, and if we
are constrained within schools because of the way we think about things.
Right, and Black and Brown communities, right, that is where so much of our learning takes place, and yet it is not honored in schools. And that's one of the things we're really seeing now, is that schools made this really clear distinction between home and school. They said, you've got to be in the seats, you got to be learning, here's the only place you can do it. What you do at home isn't learning. We've seen that again and again, right? So then all of a sudden we have this moment where suddenly education has to happen in the home, and we're trying to jam schooling into the home instead of learning from homes about how schooling happens. And like Bianca Baldridge's work is really important here, and other people who look at education that happens outside of school, of formal education, education that happens outside of formal schooling spaces. Okay, we need to transition, thank you. I'm trying to stay on time here, but this conversation is great. So we're gonna watch the second video, and I heard it's all ready to go. So Stephanie, can we try queuing that up? Or Brian?
All too often, justice is denied for our girls, especially our girls of color. So often our girls are told that they are a distraction or that they have a bad attitude, when in fact across the country, Black girls are the group that is the most likely to be criminalized at literally every single stage of our lives. Beginning in preschool, Black girls are most likely to be suspended. Preschool. This is not an inequity, this is a crisis.
Push-out refers to the policies, practices, and conditions that render young people vulnerable to contact with the juvenile court or criminal legal system in the future. We know that young people who experience extraordinary traumas and other disruptions in their lives are at greatest risk of school push-out.
For me, push-out manifested in my 9th grade year of high school. That year, I was homeless, my mother had moved halfway across the country, and I had to fend for myself and my sister. During that time period, I missed a lot of school. And instead of stopping to ask why or figure out the root cause of my truancy, teachers, administration, and faculty alike disciplined me, put me in ISS, put me in detentions, and then threatened me with truancy and threatened to take me to court. That completely affected my 9th grade year. My grades slipped, my extracurriculars weren't as fun anymore, and I had no motivation to continue in high school. I've lived in over 15 cities, and I know that this happens to girls everywhere.
As someone who's been directly impacted by the criminal injustice system, I am personally dedicated to reforming our system to one that makes good on the American promise of justice for all. When we discipline and detain our girls, we fail to see their humanity. We fail to see the trauma, the violence, and abuse so many of them have experienced. And that is why today I'm introducing the Ending Punitive, Unfair, School-Based Harm that is Overt and Unresponsive to Trauma Act, also known as the Ending Push-Out Bill. This bill is aimed at dismantling the school-to-confinement pipeline by creating an ecosystem within our schools where all our children, especially children of color, can heal and can thrive.
The Ending Pushout Bill is an opportunity for us to explore how we can respond to the traumas, how we can engage young people in the co-construction of their learning, and how we can facilitate a space where educators feel supported in their capacity to provide the guidance and learning that our young people need to become the effective scholars we know they can be.
Federal government must address this crisis with the urgency that it deserves. We must continue to fight to develop policies that intentionally work to make all people whole. It is our responsibility as lawmakers to work in partnership with community to develop holistic solutions that actually deliver justice. And that is exactly what we did with the People's Justice Guarantee and exactly what we did with the Ending Pushout Act, which begins to codify some of the tenets laid out in our bold progressive vision for a more just and humane criminal legal system.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Brian, for getting that video going. You know, I've really been thinking about, I like this video and I picked it for two reasons. One was because I really appreciated the focus on Black girls specifically and their experiences in school, right? Girls of color and Black girls in particular are often ignored in conversations around criminalization in education. But also the broader conversation about what one way to address this, you know. So while we want to reimagine the system as a whole, Critical Resistance, the organization I mentioned at the beginning, says previously in their definition of abolition that we need to focus on developing practical strategies for taking small steps that push us towards making our dreams real. And so I'm trying to think of this kind of distinction between practical strategies that move us in the right direction and reform. And reform, Dylan Rodriguez just had an article in Medium called Reform is Counterinsurgency, which was such an interesting way to problematize reform. And so just thinking about practical strategies that you're engaging or reading about or witnessing that move us all towards making our abolitionist dreams and ideas more of a reality.
So one group of folks that I also wanted to draw on in response to this question is the work of educator organizers. There are a number of different groups that have been doing work for a really long time. NYCOR, the New York Collective of Radical Educators, Teachers for Social Justice. There's a group in San Francisco, as well as Chicago. There's the Nepantla Teachers Group. There's the Radical STEM Educators that I'm a part of. There are many different groups doing this work, and there are also scholar activist groups who are doing this work. I put a link to a Google Doc in the chat where I list many of these teacher activist and scholar activist organizations. And the thing that I really enjoy about organizing work, and my good friend, Dr. Farima Khurshid always reminds me, is that organizing work is healing work. We can't talk about abolition without talking about healing. And by doing organizing work, it really is a healing space with relationships that you create with people that you can do this work together. I also think that through organizing work, we engage in political education. So we are reading and studying together. And there are also folks who are creating their own schools. And one of my new colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Josue Lopez, invited Ashley Herring to speak to our methods class. We joined our methods classes, and she started a school in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Blackyard. And so people are really creating these new spaces that I think it's a really exciting time, because folks have been doing this work for a long time. And now more people are getting on board. And so I think it's an exciting opportunity. The other place that I think about also is in teacher education. So we know that pre-service teachers as well as practicing teachers are 80% white. Where I teach in Pennsylvania, the teaching force is actually 95% white. And I believe strongly in empowering also white teachers and white students to have a critical consciousness, to understand the history of redlining and the eugenics movement, and to understand where standardized testing came from. They came from eugenicists, right? And I work with math teachers, and math teachers like myself, I have an engineering degree. I didn't get to take classes where I learned that history. So I'm committed to teaching that history also with my students so that they can be empowered also to engage in abolitionist work when they become teachers.
Yeah, I think another, and thank you so much for that, Dr. Kokka. Another thing that comes up, I mean, just in real practices, you know, this might get me uninvited from the RILE conference next year, but yo, I can't mention Stanford without talking about the Stanford Binet assessment, right? I mean, come on, like, let's quit playing, right? We got to be clear about where it is that we are. So I think one of the practices of abolition is being able to name what it is that we're in and how that history impacts what it is that we're talking about. So to Dr. Kokka's point, I think in practical ways, when we engage abolition and we see some schools do this, and in this COVID/racial reckoning moment, we're seeing some very interesting things, especially around standardized testing, right? So some school districts have said, look, this thing hasn't told us anything in the first place, get rid of it. No one has died because we didn't get a particular stain on a standardized test. Right? But hella people are dying from COVID who are Black, Brown, Indigenous because of inequities that we dare not address, right? So I think around really asking these deep questions around what is in our wheelhouse to end, right? So the end of standardized testing, they're not telling us anything in the first place. Another thing that becomes important is now revisiting our curriculum. Somebody wrote in the chat, and I think this is important. We always teach the histories of people of color in the wrong way. We always teach the degradation. We never teach the resistance. And now if you revisit curriculum, now the resistance should be central, right? Because the resistance is what you can make relevant to the current moment, right? So this thing around being able to say, no, folks never took this lying down. So now here is another moment by which to engage. And one of my comrades, Patrick Kamenyan, always talks about, look, when we talk about dispossession, it has to be in the conversation around what does it mean to recoup. So now our classrooms are the places where we are recouping what has been stolen. Now we are engaging, rewriting this particular narrative. Another thing that becomes important, you know, and this might really get me uninvited, man, that TPA thing, it has to go. It can't exist anymore. What are we doing, right? This thing around assessing, having someone assess your teaching from a spot who does not know the context of teaching, and we know teaching is 100% contextual, is now evaluating you on your teaching? Yo, look, we got hella definitions of insanity, but that has to be in one of them, right? And I think it's important for us to put this out there and say, look, there's some things that we can do that are in our disposable, but it just takes the will to engage them. And I think when we actually start to thinking about that collectively, so when Dr. Kokka mentions people who are organizing from these particular capacities, we now have a wheelhouse from which to pull from and ask a different set of questions. And I'm prepared for my uninvitation. Word up.
You don't need no invitation, but I'm just going to add one thing here, right? Like that isn't insanity. And I want to be clear that one of the things about abolition is always examining our own language, right? That isn't insanity. That's white supremacy. That is ableism. That is cis heteropatriarchy. That is the systems, right? So EdTPA being something that where a person that's completely devoid of our own teaching context has the right to tell us whether or not we are good teachers. That's not insanity. It's the way, it's exactly what y'all said before. It's the way the system is supposed to work, right? And so I want us to always be thinking about how we engage abolition through our language as well as our ideas. Jonathan, were you going to jump in here for a minute?
I was just going to say to pick up on this point, Professor Stovall's point about EdTPA, I think it signals some of the ways that teachers are harmed by abolitionist or by carceral approaches within education, and really the kind of foundational nature of those approaches. And I saw other questions in the chat around how this impacts higher education and community colleges and the experiences of students across educational spaces. And I think we see these modes of surveillance, these modes of evaluation that are so deeply pathological. And I think, Subini, it gets to the point that you were just making, that this is cooked into what we accept as the starting point for our questions within schools. So it was, the COVID moment was in some ways so shocking because of all of the investment in maintaining progress at grade level progress within a particular disciplinary subject area in K through 12 and in higher ed. And you kind of say, if ever there were a moment when the irrelevance of narrowly defined curricular boundaries were on full display before us, when in fact, our narrow definitions of what education could be, which have contributed to the creation of this kind of a world, this sort of a world in which we will dispose of people in mass, that's what those narrow approaches to learning have produced. And so the question of what we could be doing otherwise, I think has to be front and center around this. And to me, again, I saw someone mention in the chat, Freire and other sorts of approaches. These are conversations we've been having for so long. I mean, the first school, one of the first schools where I taught high school, Dr. Pedro Albizu Campos High School in Chicago, which focuses on a Freirean approach to its curriculum. We're talking about a school that has been open since the mid-70s, right? That was created because of the push out, and we just watched that video around push outs that are specifically targeting Black girls, and we could think about what's going on in relation to across different populations. But the push out rate for Puerto Ricans in Chicago was 75% in the 70s. And so this is not a new 2020 problem. This is built into our mainstream institutions. And so that alternative approach that was created within that school involves a whole community-based kind of orientation where I taught civics, which involved the students leaving one of the buildings, walking through the neighborhood to my classroom, which was in an HIV health center, one of the oldest Latinx Puerto Rican serving HIV health centers in the country. And that's where I taught my civics class. And so I want you, and teaching that class involved brokering with local gang leaders to ensure the safety of our students, involved engaging with the local dynamics within our neighborhoods to kind of say, what are we up to here? What are we up to? What's the focus? What's it mean if we use these terms like student-centered learning, but then we go on doing business as usual around curricular subject areas? This means that teachers, we could be approaching teacher preparation in entirely different ways, community engagement entirely different ways, curricular subject areas in entirely different ways, and just the broader world that we're trying to create could be reconceived altogether.
And how do we capture what you were doing as a teacher on the EdTPA? We can't, right? We can't. And how do we capture what the kids were learning on these assessments? We can't.
I don't trust, that's the thing. I don't trust people to evaluate me. Get out of here. Who are you? I don't trust, and I'm the expert. In this community, if I'm from this community and my curriculum is rooted in this community's experience, then who are you to come in here? You're ignorant. And I think that our schools of education need to recognize their ignorance in the face of the community-based knowledges that they're preparing teachers to enter into to then reproduce the stigmatization of those students. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I was kind of interrupting you, but I mean, I think you made the point. And the point also is like the things that they actually learned, the things that they actually remembered are being in that HIV clinic, right? It may not be every unit that you taught. They remember being in that space. They remember the gang members outside who were making sure they got safely inside. That's what they remember, right? Those are the lived experiences of that space that you can't assess. But somehow we still think that teaching is a set of best practices, right? Mm-hmm. Somehow we still think that we can engage in teacher education and that it starts the minute they come into our teacher prep classes versus it started from their whole life, being in schools, often in families and legacies of educators. And I mean, the one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is, especially when we think about teachers, is how the teacher education process itself, just teacher prep, is so dehumanizing, right? It basically is like, you have no way of understanding the world. You have no way of understanding teaching or learning. And so we're going to teach you 5 ways to do this, right? And the best teachers I see come out of teacher preparation, who come in to teacher preparation class and they're like, I'm gonna take some things from what y'all teach me, and then I'm gonna bring exactly who I am and all that I know into this. And the ones who take up wholesale all of what we teach in teacher education as like biblical text, right, as sacred text that they can't change, they're struggling and they're leaving after the 1st or 2nd year because they just have no understanding of what it means to be a professional who works with other human beings. It means you have to be a human yourself.
Period.
Right. One of the things we want to touch on, right, is that teacher education, but like all things are contextual, right? Even the conversations around abolition. So we just wrote a law review where we're arguing for the abolition of youth prisons. And there, we basically argued that exactly what y'all are saying is that if we're going to do these things, the argument isn't here's exactly what we build in their place, because it matters in every space. It's going to be different based on the context. And people don't want that kind of answer. Like, how do we have more conversations that come up with more complex answers that aren't, here's the thing we can put for the whole state of California or any state that where we're trying to pretend that we've got a great assessment system in place.
Right. I mean, this is a question around community control. And Jonathan, one love and shout out to Vita Sita for all the work that they have been doing. And then another thing, and I remember that civics class, Prof. Rosa, in terms of when you all centered those young folks and that lesson that you all taught about them being historical beings, straight from Freddie, right? So this idea around thinking about what does it mean to be a historical being, right? The subject, but not the object of history, right? So this thing around when we start to think about this, and now when we talk about context, now we say that each school, each neighborhood, each young person is contextual. And now we have to use, as Maxine dared us to think about, the myriad of processes to engage young people, not just the 5 that we know ain't gonna work in the first place. Can we say that? Like half of the stuff that we get in teacher-ed programs, we know is not gonna work in our classrooms. So now we have to recreate something that is in and of ourselves to do something different. And I think therein lie the antecedents to abolition, to really think about what we do on the day-to-day and enhancing that with the people that we say we care about.
So I'm sorry to have to interject this way. I know a lot of people are mad that I have to kind of cut it a hard stop right now. It's hot in here because of all the knowledge that was spit. But thank you to all the panelists. We appreciate this conversation. What was said here, it doesn't stay here. We hope that we can extend this conversation in other spaces and continue doing this in whatever communities folks are from and occupy the space in. Again, thank you, panelists. But now I have to give the floor back to Dr. Ball. And again, thank you all for being here. But Dr. Ball, this virtual space is once again yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Dr. Stovall, Jonathan, Rosa, Maxine, Kari, Subini. This has been fantastic. Thank you for dropping this knowledge on us and for sharing your profound insights. Thank you for your skillful handling of these kind of issues and bringing this to our attention. And now, as the Day 2 of this conference draws to a close, I wanted to remind you that RILE is committed to bringing an interdisciplinary scholarly focus to these kinds of factors. We are very pleased that you brought these issues up, that you reminded us that today's scholars are fighting for a reality that does not yet exist. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, what are we willing to do to end these practices that are inhumane? We're not talking about reform, we're talking about something very different. And so As leaders in the field, RILE will be continuing these conversations, and we want to work with the next generation of scholars and practitioners so that they can advance and move forward these kinds of discussions. In these troubling times, we're pleased to bring these kinds of discussions to you, to Stanford, and to the field. It's our desire to stimulate not only conversation about these critical issues before us, but to motivate you to move toward groundbreaking research and action. Action that has the power to change these current realities so that post-COVID realities are not to be more of the same. Rather, what we want to move toward is excellence, movement, equitable education for all. So as I'm going to encourage everyone not to stop this conversation. Find a friend, have a conversation, and do not let this end. Think about what role are you going to play and what are you going to do about these kinds of issues. So I just want to bring your attention to the fact that we to see you all again tomorrow for installment number 3 towards achieving the kinds of goals that we've laid out here. Tomorrow, our topic will be on educating Native communities. We will have Dr. Linda Tuhiwai Smith from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. We'll have our very own Teresa Laframboise, internationally renowned work that she does. And we will also have Dr. Marie Baptiste from the University of from the university in Canada. And she will be talking with us. And I wanted to point out that she is one of our own alumni. So we're looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. We want to see you again at 3 p.m. We may go a minute over in time because these are pertinent conversations that we're having, that we're thinking about. And so we'll see you at 3 o'clock Pacific time tomorrow. So until then, we wish you peace. We wish you passion. We wish you vision and commitment. All the very best to each of you from the RILE program. Thank you.